wanted to know about Manifest Destiny, and I'm going to talk about what Manifest Destiny is, kind of the basics, why Manifest Destiny is a thing, how Manifest Destiny actually happened, and how westward expansion happened. Then finally the implications for a lot of different things, for example, race. That's a big one that we're going to talk about. And then finally, the end results of that. So Manifest Destiny is the attitude that America, white America, not only has the ability to exist from coast to coast, but ought to do that. And so that mindset and that goal helped fuel Western settlement, indigenous removal, and war with Mexico. Three very, very important things in the history of like the founding of America, but aren't necessarily talked about kind of as one whole thing. The who in this situation are Anglo-Protestants. Shocking. This happened from about late 1780s all the way through the mid 1850s, and this happened in the continental United States, more specifically the contiguous 48 states. And the why kind of comes from the same line of thought that helped the Puritans form their city on the hill in Massachusetts. And a lot of this has to do with the way that nationalism and religion are oftentimes tied together. So just like the Puritans, the pioneers similarly believed that they should go forth and create this better place, this better world for them to live and worship in. So when you take that nationalism, the two ways of nationalism that happened with the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, and you create a demand for more territory, what with more people coming into the United States, population booming, and people doing farming on larger tracts of land, all of the things in combination mean that you have to move westward, because you're just running out of space, frankly. And a lot of that also has to do with the wave of populism that happened with Andrew Jackson's presidency, that every white man, should have opportunity and should have equal opportunity to go forward and do with whatever he pleases in his own life. And the how comes from four main places. The first is Louisiana Purchase, the second is the annexation of Texas, the third is the incorporation of the Oregon Territory, and finally the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But first is the Louisiana Purchase. In the early 19th century, in 1801, France was broke. They had no money coming off of war and the French Revolution. Napoleon was desperately trying to sell off assets and trying to make money for France. So in 1801, Robert Livingston and James Madison were sent by Thomas Jefferson to kind of explore this new territory that France had taken from Spain several years prior. And this was a wonderful territory full of a large group of lands, but the thing that was most important was the port of New Orleans and the Mississippi River, which led the trade into the interior of the continent. And Livingston and Madison thought this was a really great piece of territory, and Thomas Jefferson in 1803 decided to buy it. All that was there was indigenous people, buffalo, and a whole bunch of grassland in the larger portion of it, in the western portion. And though Thomas Jefferson questioned its constitutionality, he did go ahead and exercise the first massive bit of presidential power that's not specifically to the Constitution. You might remember that Thomas Jefferson was a huge proponent of things reserved to the states, but he knew that this was an opportunity that had to be seized, and there wasn't a whole lot of time in which to do it. So for $15 million, the United States doubled its territory with this 800,000 square mile chunk of land that Lewis and Clark later explored. And basically everything east of the Mississippi had been settled by the Americans. So they needed to move westward in order to have any new territory and new farmland. The second major portion of westward expansion was the annexation of Texas. In 1836, after a lengthy war with Mexico, Texas was broke, and actually in 1837, which is 1 year later, after independence, Texas Congress said maybe we should see about becoming part of the United States. And because of the touchy issue of slavery and what to do with states that were slave versus free dating back to the Missouri Compromise, there wasn't a whole lot of options, and that wasn't really an option at the time for the United States to go ahead and annex Texas. However, that environment was just so volatile. And Martin Van Buren and James K. Polk were just like, okay. By 1845, they were ready to annex that new land that was part of Mexico, then was its own independent territory. And then the similar thing happened in Oregon in 1846. Van Buren basically said 5440 or fight, meaning the upper parallel boundary of the state of Washington versus British Columbia. That whole area had been jointly occupied by the United States and the United Kingdom for about 10 years before that point. And until that point, they were just like, okay, we're just going to deal with it. But with this wave of manifest destiny and westward expansion, they decided to go for it. And a lot of that land, especially like Oregon, Utah, had been settled by pioneers moving westward. For example, Brigham Young took the Mormons that way, and a lot of them settled along that track so they could have their religious freedoms and practice the way that they wanted. And obviously Joseph Smith believed that was going to be their shining city on a hill in Salt Lake City and in Provo. And then the final portion of westward expansion that kind of cemented that territory was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, which was the end of the Mexican-American War. Very volatile over a large swath of territory. The thing that's most important to pull from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is that it expanded citizenship rights to the former Mexican citizens, which about 90% of people did take. And then the final portion of that is this lower territory, part of Arizona and New Mexico, the Gadsden Purchase in the 1850s, which completed it. And the reason behind the Gadsden Purchase was to kind of go ahead and make railroads a priority. But amid all of this was a whole racial overtone and a lot of racial tension. And the earliest thing we can look at is the issue dating back to the treatment of the Native Americans. And if you look at Washington, Washington really believed in non-intercourse with the natives. He said, essentially the natives can have their land if they assimilate to our culture. We're not trying to take it from them, but we need them to behave like we do. So he was a big proponent of speaking English and of farming and owning slaves even, if that was necessary. And in the course of Washington's presidency and John Adams's presidency and in Thomas Jefferson's presidency and James Madison's presidencies, this whole concept of the Non-Intercourse Acts were passed. So 1790, 1793, 1796, 1799, 1802, and then the final one happened in 1834. Those all protected the rights of the indigenous people to their land. And in fact, Washington stated that no state or person can purchase your lands unless some public treaty held under the authority of the United States. The general government will never consent to your being defrauded. And whether or not that actually happened, that was what Washington stated, and that's what he believed to be true. And Thomas Jefferson believed a lot of the same thing. His emphasis was really more on farming. And his other main emphasis was trying to get them to farm and have this different version of forward motion and of progress. The one thing that Jefferson really focused on that Washington didn't was securing the indigenous people to the citizenship of the United States by offering them citizenship, trying to make sure that they didn't pledge allegiance to the British or to the French or to the Spanish. That was really important for him in his policy. And under Thomas Jefferson, the same some land was purchased under treaty or duress, and came up with the first land exchange. Land exchange is when you would purchase land from an indigenous settlement, purchasing it, and then also granting them land west of the Mississippi River. And the similar thing happened under James Monroe. His Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun, in 1824, came up with a policy of exchanges which gained traction and created Indian and Arkansas Territory, which are now obviously Arkansas and Oklahoma. And John Quincy Adams inherited Monroe and Calhoun's policy, and his goal was to be as non-forceful as possible, and he was successful, except in the case of Georgia. Georgia was very indignant and did not want to follow this policy, and so John Quincy Adams had to independently make treaties with the Creeks and the Cherokees to help them relinquish their land. And then we finally get to the worst of all, which is Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson had a long storied history of dealing with Native Americans in a very, very negative way. Under previous administrations, each individual nation was treated separately. That was not Jackson's policy at all. He treated them as a whole and moved them all from the southern United States to the Indian Territory, which is something that was supported by southern farmers who needed and wanted land to farm on. So that's why that was actually able to go through without much indignance from the Southern Americans, because it was something that they wanted and something that they needed to utilize for their own purposes later. Jackson actually called his northern critics hypocrites because they suffocated their indigenous people and actually killed them off instead of just relocating them. In Jackson's mind, it was a lot kinder to move them forcefully out of their own territory. And he actually called this progress, because if the indigenous people couldn't assimilate and work in the way that the future is going, then they're SOL. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 passed in the Senate with a margin of 28 to 19, and in the House of Representatives 101 to 97. So it was a little bit closer than you might think based on what you've learned from history. And that led to the forced expulsion, which we know as the Trail of Tears, which occurred from 1830 to 1850 and included major massive reoccupation of the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, and Seminole Indians. And it was extremely violent. They were marched with militia from post to post. Anywhere they needed to be, they had an armed militia. And this was oftentimes very violent. And especially when we look at numbers, extremely high mortality rates for these groups. The Cherokee, for example, started from their home with about 16,000, and between 1,000 and 2,000 individuals died, whether it be from exposure, disease, starvation, or infighting, especially in Oklahoma once everything was settled. Then the major issue was dealing with slavery. Texas was a slave territory, which is why it was initially kind of hesitant to allow Texas to annex itself to the United States, especially when we look at the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which allowed Missouri to be admitted as a free state and Maine as, other way around, Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state. And that also set the boundary for slaveholding territories and states as the southern border of Missouri, the 3630 line. And Northerners were very concerned because this would lead to diminished economic opportunity for themselves in the future, because if there are more slave states, then the opportunity is diminished for Northerners who do not own slaves in terms of just like farming and how many people can work a piece of land. Another issue with the Mexican territory was that a lot of them were not Anglo. They were Hispanic, they were indigenous, they were, some of them, Asian. And so that issue dealt with assimilation, which is why I think California is extremely different in terms of that, even today in the United States. They just weren't Anglo. And along the Oregon Trail, you have a lot more of these unique and non-Protestant kinds of Christianity. So you're dealing with a lot of Mormons, particularly wanting to worship in a way that's a little bit different than those Anglos and those Protestants did. Manifest Destiny gave credence to Anglo-Saxon superiority over blacks and natives and Hispanics and Catholics. And John O'Sullivan, who actually coined the term Manifest Destiny in 1845, said that race was the key to history of nations and the downfall of empires. So in his mind, this Manifest Destiny was completely justified based on the things that had happened with the annexation of Texas, with the end of the Mexican-American War, and with the Louisiana Purchase as well, and the Trail of Tears. The Anglo-Saxons saw themselves as liberty-loving, and they saw themselves as a triumph of civilization over what they called the mongrel races. And the calls for the annexation of all of Mexico rather than just the northern part were halted because of the fear that they will not be able to assimilate this many non-white Catholics with that same kind of ability that they did in the rest of the United States. The end result of Manifest Destiny and westward expansion is that the continental United States was formed. It's the shape that we know today. And it did lead credence to the things that we're dealing with today. It left this really kind of bitter taste in the mouths of minorities, people of color, and people of minority religions. Because of Manifest Destiny, you know, you're taught that it's a very positive thing. It had a whole lot of implications that we're still dealing with today. And some of the end thoughts that I have on Manifest Destiny is that we kind of see it as extolling American virtues of people and in their society, and it reclaimed and remade the West in agrarian America like Thomas Jefferson wanted. And it also kind of helped those Protestants reinstate the destiny of their essential duty of their religion. So, for better or worse, that's what Manifest Destiny is, and we are absolutely still living the effects of Manifest Destiny, especially in regards to racism and religion, and all of those different things. We are still experiencing the residual effects of Manifest Destiny, and those things, I think, are not something that we really focus on in history courses. So I hope that that is kind of a brief primer on Manifest Destiny and on westward expansion, the implications, how it happened, and why it happened. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you for watching.